I'd like to say I was happy to be here, but I'm not, actually. Not happy to be here at all. I would rather not be doing this. It rather feels like I'm at a trial of an old friend. So I'm really not happy to be here. I'm happy to see you lot, but I'm not particularly happy to be here. The BBC is like an old friend. I was interested to hear what Ruth said there, and the BBC is like an old friend. I remember growing up. This is old geezer reminiscing now, so if anybody wants to go for a cup of coffee, this is the time. Growing up, at one point I lived in this house where there was no electricity, gas lighting, outdoor plumbing, all the rest of it. Pretty squalid place. And my young brother and I, every Saturday morning, our chore was to take our wee toy wheelbarrow and my father would get the accumulator out the back of the radio, an accumulator, a huge battery. My brother and I would put it in the wheelbarrow and wheel it down to the local garage to get charged, so that it was charged up for the weekend. And then that was our treat. Then we were able to listen to children's family favourites and the Billy Cotton Band show and things like that. And it was a real treat. The BBC was important to us. And later, I was particularly fond of comedy programmes like Beyond Our Ken and Round the Horn and the Navy Lark and Sorry I Haven't a Clue. The radio was important, the BBC was important, it was part of our lives. And we got to see TV as well, because our grandparents who lived nearby, they had a posh house, they had electricity, and they had indoor plumbing, and they had a fridge and lights and a TV. So we would go along there for lunch on a Sunday, and then we get to watch TV afterwards. And 60 years ago, I actually looked it up, what would I would have been watching on the TV 60 years ago on a Sunday afternoon after lunch. And we were watching children's TV, and one of the programmes was Circus Boy. All right, it was an American programme, but it was shown on the BBC, and it was wonderful. It was a boy and a circus, and he had an elephant, and I was 6 years old, and I thought this was wonderful. And the boy, by the way, was played by an actor called Mickey Braddock, who you'll probably know better as Mickey Dolenz, the drummer and singer from the Monkees. Memories. And then after that, there would be a TV adaptation of a Dickens novel. But for a long time, I grew up thinking Dickens actually worked for the BBC. I thought he actually wrote for the BBC. The BBC didn't talk like the people in my life, in real life. I never thought that was how real people talked, but that was how the radio talked, and that was how the TV talked, and it was a special voice. And the only person in real life, and we probably all had somebody like this in our lives, and this is an imagined one, but your Uncle George from England, who'd turn up at the house every once in a while, just for an occasional, but he's no a real uncle. You know, he's maybe some distant relative, or just he's got some vague connection with the family, but you call him Uncle George from England, because he's got a voice. It sounds a bit like the folk on the radio and on the TV, the folk on the BBC. And he's always very dapper, always very well dressed, always very respectable, possibly with a bow tie. And he tells tales of his travel to exotic lands and his adventures, and he teaches you stuff like how to whistle with your fingers, and he makes coins appear out from behind your ears and things like that. And you think he's wonderful. just the same as you think the BBC is wonderful. But then you hear the adults talking one day and you find out that the reason Auntie Margaret isn't around is because Uncle George from England used to slap her about. And the reason his visits are only occasional, the reason there's long absences is because he's been in the jail for petty fraud. And the stories that he's telling you are all lifted from the Reader's Digest. And naturally, you're disappointed, and you feel betrayed, and you feel angry. But you still feel a certain affection. And that's the way I felt about the BBC. In 2014, in the campaign leading up to the 2014 referendum, the BBC betrayed me. They let me down. The BBC let itself down. It's not what I thought it was. It's not what it's meant to be. It's failed. The BBC is disconnected from Scotland. Scotland is changing, and the BBC is not reflecting that change. It's no longer relevant in Scotland. It is not of Scotland. It's like the British parties squatting in Holyrood. Down with the BBC. No, I don't want to destroy the BBC. I want to save the BBC. As an institution, the BBC is a great template for public service broadcasting. The failure's not because of the BBC as an institution. It is a great template for public service broadcasting, one we would do well to maintain. The BBC is not failing because of the licence fee. The licence fee, nobody has ever been able to suggest to me a better funding model for independent public service broadcasting. The BBC's failure is certainly not due to its personnel, its staff, its people. Mostly, they're professionals, decent people, just trying to do a good job. They only want to make good radio and good TV. The BBC's failure is a failure of management, and by extension, a failure of regulation. The BBC, as happens often in large, complex organisations, the BBC has come to serve itself and the British establishment which enables it. It's failed, the management has failed to prevent an ethos developing in which that ethos that has developed has been the cause of the problems that we saw in the referendum campaign leading up to 2014. That ethos is the cause of things like what we recently saw with Wings Over Scotland and Peter Curran's YouTube channels being taken down. That wasn't a failure of the BBC as an institution. It wasn't a failure of the BBC's people. It was a failure of management. Management should have prevented that happening, and the management didn't. BBC in Scotland is broken. To the extent that we have public service broadcasting in Scotland, it is failing the public it is supposed to serve. How do we fix it? How do we reconnect our public service broadcasting with the Scottish people? The failure of the BBC is a failure of management. That management is in London. The failure of the BBC is a failure of regulation. That regulator is in London. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I know where we must start. As with all else, we start by bringing it home. Broadcasting in Scotland must be governed in Scotland. At the moment, the BBC is broadcasting to Scotland on behalf of the British establishment. Broadcasting in Scotland must be broadcasting for Scotland. Thank you.